Today's guest has been feted by everyone, from Prince Charles to Caroline Lucas to the Guardian newspaper, and today he's on Zestology. Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation. Welcome back to the podcast all about energy, vitality, and motivation. I'm Tony Wrighton, sweltering in the middle of summer. I hope your summer's going well. I've got all the windows and doors open at the moment. I'm recording this. I've just taken my shirt off as well, which is probably more information than you really needed. But, that's what summer's all about. And I'm going to be going to get some vitamin D very shortly out in the garden. So let me tell you a little bit about today's guest, who is the perfect guest to have on Zestology. Obviously, on this podcast, we often focus on energy and very specific hacks and tweaks and supplements that you might put into practice to get more energy. And, one of the things that I've spoken about a lot recently is, for instance, mouth taping, which is spectacularly working for me at the moment. My Oura Ring stats on sleep are better than they've been in, certainly since my son was born. Since being a parent, I'm getting longer sleep than ever before, but certainly since Stan came along. But even more than that, it's not just the stats. I just wake up in the morning feeling better, and I don't feel as edgy overnight, and my nose is definitely clearer as well. It is the best hack that I've put into practice this year, and it's so easy. It costs virtually nothing. One little roll of tape costing £3 is going to last me 4 months or something. It's brilliant. I really feel like I'm beating the system a little bit. I have also been putting into practice some CBD supplementation, which I talked about over the last few weeks as well. And I wonder if with CBD that is helping with the sleep as well. I don't really feel it that much in the evening. It maybe takes the edge off just slightly, but I wonder if that's helping with sleep as well. But those are the sort of hacks that I normally talk about on this podcast. Today, we're going to go deeper. As I said earlier, today's guest has been feted by everyone from Prince Charles to the Guardian newspaper. He represents one of the deepest thinkers we've had on Zestology. And sometimes, as I say, we look at mouth taping, we look at supplements, we look at CBD. And sometimes I want to look bigger. And today I wanted to explore with him what type of life we want to lead in 5, 10 and 20 years' time. As you'll hear on this podcast, sometimes I just arrange podcasts because I am absolutely fascinated by the author and his topics. And I sort of know that when I follow my own passions, you're going to enjoy it as well. And I just know that from the feedback that I get. So Tim's book, Post Growth, that's his book, Professor Tim Jackson. And it explores everything from living through a pandemic, what really matters, whether capitalism is broken, and other topics of proper depth. So we're getting a little bit more meta today. It's big picture today. Sometimes it's CBD gummies and mouth taping, and sometimes it's big picture. And I started by asking him a worrying question, which was on my mind. Here is Professor Tim Jackson. Look, sometimes I'm really keen to do interviews on Zestology just because I'm so interested in the topic myself. And I wonder, as a kind of initial question, do you worry that these are the kind of issues that not enough people are concerned about, not enough people ruminate over? I know you said you wanted to reach a bigger audience with your book, but is this the kind of thing that the mainstream, that pick up a paper on the tube and read every day. And I'm not denigrating anybody. I'm just saying, how many people actually worry about these things and about post-growth and the myth of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable question. In a way, that was kind of what I was trying to do. I mean, it's almost like you're saying maybe you haven't reached wide enough, Tim, which is fair enough, because as you say, a lot of the time that's part of the wallpaper almost, the language around growth. It's really interesting when I've been working in this field for quite a long time, so I'm very, very aware of it. But if you kind of try and listen out for that language, you find that it's all over the place, that politicians can hardly speak without mentioning the impact on growth and what growth will be. And so it has has this sort of quality where actually, yeah, fine, it's great, politicians talk about it all the time, but what's it really got to do with me, kind of thing. And similarly, I suppose the arguments around capitalism have been a bit what could you say, they've been sort of sabotaged in a way by the sort of rather silly but still ongoing dichotomy between capitalism and communism, and the sort of supposed victory of capitalism once the Iron Curtain came down, and we now have the final solution to the kind of society that we want to be in. And those words, they can be a bit off-putting, but I think that question actually, what kind of society do we want to be in, is a question that everybody is interested in. I mean, I have not been anywhere where that hasn't been of interest. So that's, part of my experience from the previous book was actually going to some really surprising places. Like, I gave talks in theatres and had discussions in literary societies and was, approached by poets and design artists who wanted to talk about it, because the fundamental question behind the words of, post-growth and life after capitalism is what kind of society do we want for our kids? What kind of world do we want to live in? And in fact, the German translation of the book, interestingly, has gone for a title which is basically how do we want to live? And that, I think, is something that everybody's interested in.
Yeah. And what does it mean then on an individual basis? I think, with many ideas around capitalism and in terms of what that means day to day, we mentioned buying a new computer, but whatever it is, making 4 different purchases on Amazon in the last hour, for example, what is your vision for a post-capitalist future that kind of works with what we've got at the moment?
Well, let me just give you a little example, which is a kind of example. I mean, it's one that I explore in the book, and it comes from the experience that we've had over the last year. So the pandemic's been a kind of tragic learning ground in many ways. But some of the lessons that we learned from it are incredibly important, and they're not the easiest things in the world for people to grasp the detail of the economics, but they're very, very simple when you think of them anecdotally. And so, what we learned, 2 things really that we learned in the pandemic, that above all else, one is that health is more important than wealth. When push comes to shove, actually governments did what they ought to have done. They put aside the pursuit of growth. They put aside the sort of accumulation of wealth, and they focused on the question of health, because health really matters. And without it, the rest of prosperity kind of doesn't matter that much. I mean, it's dispensable at the end of the day. If you have enough to ensure the health of yourself and your family and the health of your community, and actually ultimately also the health of the planet. And the reason why that's particularly interesting is because health has a characteristic which is very different from the accumulation of wealth. Accumulation of wealth is about having more and more, but actually health depends on balance, and balance depends on not having more and more, sometimes having less. There are places, and this is a really important point to make, in the poorest countries in the world where having more is incredibly important. But actually, if you keep on with that journey of having more and more, and you don't recognize where the stopping point is, you miss the point of balance, and you go heading into a territory where you end up in a world whereas the World Health Organization has told us more people die each year from diseases of overconsumption than they do from undernutrition. And that's extraordinary. That means capitalism doesn't know where to stop. And the system that we've created around growth isn't going to tell us. So we have to refine that idea of balance. And we have to kind of put that at the heart of our economy, at the heart of our society, and maybe too at the heart of our lives as well. So there's and the other, I said kind of two, and the other thing which I think is, to me even more shocking really in a way, is that in the decades that preceded the pandemic, the most precarious livelihoods, the people who were paid least, who were least secure, who were on 0-hour contracts, had no continuity in their jobs, and whose jobs became more and more difficult because they were hounded by productivity targets, if you like. These were the people who turned out to be the most important people of all in the context of the pandemic. They were the nurses, the care workers, the people in distribution and retail, the people who cleaned our streets and our offices, for example. Because in the early days, that sense of actually a virus, a pandemic that was spreading itself through the surfaces that we touched day after day, it put one of the set of people who had been almost denigrated in society, relegated to the lowest possible division. It actually made us realize how incredibly important they were. And so all of those frontline workers, all of those key workers, they were exactly the people that capitalism had no place for. And they turned out to be the people that saved our lives. And I think we kind of owe it to, we owe it to those people, and we owe it to our society to make sure that we learn that lesson, that as we go forward, we begin to value those people. We begin to place them at the center of our understanding of what an economy is. And we protect their lives and their work against this ferocious pursuit of, productivity for the sake of profit.
None of us are perfect. We all cheat sometimes. Just interrupting this podcast for one moment to let you know that it is brought to you by our podcast partner, Blood Sugar Breakthrough. And I have a bit of a confession to make. I've just eaten a gluten-free oatcake, which isn't exactly low carb and low sugar, is it? Sometimes we just cheat, and it makes sense to have a way to maintain healthy blood sugar day in, day out, even if you have an off day or an off moment. And when I talk about blood sugar, a lot of people sort of tune out of it because they only think it's relevant to people with type 2 diabetes. But blood sugar is a topic that everybody needs to understand. And that is why I am delighted to have partnered with Blood Sugar Breakthrough, which is a bit of a breakthrough, actually. One of the big keys to having optimal health is to have balanced blood sugar. And it's something that we do talk about a lot on this podcast. And, I've been working at home all day. I am in a absolute podcast marathon recording at the moment, doing loads of interviews. Went down to the fridge, nothing in it. Went to the cupboard, nothing in it. All there was gluten-free oatcakes, and I was just hungry, so I had a couple. So what happens when you eat an oatcake? Your pancreas releases insulin, which tells your body there's plenty of energy, so now's the time to store fat. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter whether it's an oatcake or a donut or a glass of orange juice. They all have a similar effect on blood sugar. When you take a lot of carbs in too quickly, you can experience a sugar crash. And that is why it's so good that this podcast is about energy, and we've teamed up with Blood Sugar Breakthrough. So what you want is healthy blood sugar levels. You won't get that crash. And you can do that by taking Blood Sugar Breakthrough. Easy to take supplements, the result of numerous tests to find the absolute best formula for maintaining healthy blood sugar. In fact, BiOptimizers went through 5 different supplement formulations before landing on this one. And how it works is it lowers your blood sugar levels after meals. Have an oatcake, take Blood Sugar Breakthrough afterwards. That's what I've done. You can go to bloodsugarbreakthrough.health/Zestology, save 10% with code Zestology10, but actually you can save up to 33% if you buy more than one bottle at once. It's a bloodsugarbreakthrough.health/Zestology, And that works everywhere apart from the UK. And if you're in the UK, you can go to BiOptimizers.co.uk, use that code again, Zestology10, and guess what? You can use that code for all their other supplements as well, including the magnesium one, which I take every day. That's it. Back to the show. I'm off to my oatcakes. No, I'm not really. That's it now. I'm done. Seriously, no more oatcakes. You mentioned right at the start that you have you've spoken with people at a high political level on these topics. Do you get the sense? I know you said that it actually pops up in far more conversations than you might imagine, but do you get the sense that this is a juggernaut that is so difficult to turn around that it's barely worth trying? Or do you get the sense that actually, perhaps in private and in public, many people do agree with you and change is potentially closer than we might imagine?
I mean, I think in a funny kind of way, we saw change. You know, we were living for a few months in a post-growth society, and in many ways in a life after capitalism, because much of the mechanism and the machinery of capitalism and the economy basically came to a halt. And we learned some extraordinary things, like how much of that is possible to manage, the way in which governments found kind of money out of nowhere, which they'd consistently denied was possible when it came to looking for it during the years of austerity, was suddenly there to protect people's livelihoods. So we know that change is possible. That's, you know, another thing that we've kind of learned from the pandemic is how much change is possible and how fast it can occur. Yeah. So to me, there's not a question about the possibility of change. There is a question about the political willingness to change, and there's a question about power. Because there's no doubt at all that, you know, there are vested interests involved, and those vested interests will resist change. And actually, as we come out of the pandemic, they will attempt to preserve or go back to a kind of a status quo in which we're persuaded to believe the same as we were before, that we can't afford to have healthcare, that governments can't intervene in the way that protects people's lives, and that you know that our economy basically has to be a growth-based economy, or nobody's going to have any security or any work anymore. And all of those things, it seems to me, are wrong. Are there people who are prepared to listen to that? I think many more now than when that work I was talking about around prosperity without growth was first published. The conversation's become an incredibly important one. And so all of the conversations around economic recovery and build back better and so on are essentially places where we can now have this conversation seriously at the highest political level. I'm not suggesting that's a kind of easy win, but I do think it's a place in which change is possible. That change is visible in the conversations around us, and it is probably the most important thing that we can focus on as we think about the light at the end of the tunnel.
And then going from a very global to a very local perspective, and bringing it back to kind of individuals listening to this podcast now, I'm interested to know about you. Are you living a life after capitalism? How have you adapted your ways?
None of us are, really. I mean, through the pandemic, I think we kind of did in many, many ways. And there was some interesting... I'm sort of deflecting seamlessly away from me. But there was some very interesting research quite early on in lockdown, which where people identified things that they liked about the different conditions, and it went from everything from fewer cars, less contrails, less rush and anxiety, a bit more time with friends, closer relationship to nature, a slowing down of time, all kinds of things that are in a way a sort of an invitation to post-capitalism. And it's but as lockdown continued, of course, I'm not suggesting those things retained all their attraction, and there was very definitely a dark side of lockdown, which is very, very difficult to cope with. But I do think that those sort of ideas of focusing on connection and on conviviality and on taking the time to live your life in balance, and in balance with your fellow human beings, and in balance with the planet, actually these are things that one can, and I do at the personal level, try to follow. And I think it's incredibly important to say that we can't save the world by hoping that everybody at the individual level has immediately become a post-capitalist, whatever that is. But we can say, and this is a sort of paradox, that everybody has it within their power to live a different kind of life, one that is more in harmony with our values and our care and concern for each other, and indeed for the species that we share the planet with. And that's, that paradox of the fact that we're not going to get there just through individual choice, but every individual can do something, can live slightly differently, walk more, take the car less, breathe a little bit in the mornings, spend a bit more time in nature, think of care and their care for other people as a fundamental part of their own well-being. These are all values, actually, that are very widespread in society, but are continually swept away by a kind of insane rush towards innovation, productivity, busyness in pursuit of growth. And that's the sort of, if you like, the social experiment that the pandemic allowed us. Some of us in some, and I do obviously recognize that those opportunities weren't available for everybody, but there are always places where individuals can make those choices for themselves.
Yeah, it's funny how many people have said to me over the last few weeks, desperate to go to the pub, but I don't want it to go back to how it was before. I don't want to be quite as busy and quite as hectic.
And that's really interesting, that the things we miss the most that we do want back, that is that conviviality, it's that social connection and being with other people.
Yeah.
And it really tells you, it does tell you what the priorities for our health and well-being are.
Yeah. I noticed that you had that Roman Krznaric provided an endorsement for your book, and he's been on this podcast as well. And it strikes me that some of your themes are quite similar to his. I mean, he talked about the long-term thinking and how important that is, and how bad we are at it. And I suppose that's all wrapped up in the kind of topics that you're looking at.
It is, and it's sort of kind of related in the sense that, the insane rush for growth driven by productivity, which generates profits, really prioritizes always the role of innovation. So we're always in a world where we want to go faster and faster towards the newer and newer products. And we're always kind of being persuaded that the new and what we have next is going to be better than what we have at the moment and what we had before. And that's a process that kind of stops us recognizing the value of tradition, of longevity, and it also, in the same token, that we don't recognize the past and the value of the past, we don't think far enough into the future, because actually the future virtually doesn't exist. The future is a kind of frontier of endless innovation which sweeps away yesterday, even as it imagines tomorrow, and that's a desperately unsettling place to be. One of the themes of the book is how we are driven by a need for a kind of existential security, where we have an underlying anxiety about our own mortality that inevitably has us looking for a security. And yet the mechanisms through which capitalism attempts to persuade us that we have this security are endlessly restless. They're always encouraging us to be disappointed in our latest purchase or the newest thing, precisely so that they can sell us the next newest thing tomorrow. So you think of capitalism and growth as being something that delivers you happiness and well-being, but actually it trades on anxiety and disappointment because of that undermining of security. If we were secure, if capitalism gave us security, then we would no longer be tempted into this restless race to buy things, to spend money we don't have on things we don't need to persuade people we don't care about to love us, so to speak. That's
well, yeah. I mean, it goes back to what we talked about at the start. Here I am with my new computer, which makes a noisy fan every time I use the video, which is exactly what I want to use it for. And having been very excited about buying it, and I was slightly disappointed, and I'm probably going to have to buy another one.
Yeah. That's awful. When you get, I mean, we've in close to where I live, there's a DIY store, big DIY store, and obviously it's always trying to sell us the latest stuff. There'll be a kitchen refurbishment or whatever, which is great. I'm not against DIY, but what's interesting about it is it's situated right next door to the municipal recycling, as it's euphemistically called. And there's been some occasions where I've actually bought something that's fallen apart before I got out of the door and thought, that's really useful. The recycling dump is right next door. And that's why it's there, because it's almost as though there's no distance between the point of purchase and the point at which that product is of no use to us and we want the next one. And that's a horrible shortening of our timescales, which is having a devastating impact on the planet, because of course it means an acceleration of material throughput. So we can't afford it in environmental terms. It doesn't make sense in social terms, and it's undermining our own ability to have psychologically satisfying, fulfilling lives. And that in a way, again, is something that I wanted to draw out in the book.
Yeah. And just, I know I asked you about you personally, and you neatly deflected it. But on that point, perhaps a negative effect of what's been happening in the pandemic is the way that we've relied on online shopping more. And, I just bought my new book out as well, and it's almost entirely reliant on sales on Amazon. I've got a lot to thank Amazon for, but it's just so easy now. And that I feel like that has even changed from a couple of years ago, the way that we regard purchasing things on Amazon and other sites, and how disposable our purchases often are.
That's absolutely. It's very, very clear. It's clear in the value of Jeff Bezos's personal wealth, which practically doubled during that period, precisely because that online shopping provided us with easy access to things which were very, very difficult to get, would have been very, very difficult to get otherwise. And I think, I think we have to be sort of realistic about that, and certainly about our own reliance on that during this period. There were other options, for example, for doing shopping during the pandemic, and some of those I think were really good examples, like the sort of more local distribution networks around organic food, for example. Now they that is something that we invested in actually a little bit before the pandemic, but it became actually an essential resource through the pandemic at certain points, because we had the security of knowing that it was going to come, but we also had the kind of authenticity of knowing that it came from sustainable organic sources, and that the people who were working in those companies were being treated well. I think, to me, one of the biggest problems with Amazon is that, while Jeff Bezos has doubled his wealth, the work of those people distributing those things to our doorsteps day after day is as insecure as it ever was. And that makes me personally feel very, very uneasy about how that delivery mode works, and it's obviously one of the things that we have to think about very seriously, as we go forward. But it isn't all bad news, I guess, is what I'm saying, that there are parts of that, different distribution networks that don't necessarily create modern slavery, and that aren't necessarily massively damaging to the environment, and that at the same time do give us high degrees of service and a reassurance that we're getting quality goods that are not damaging the planet. And all of those things, I think, are important to people.
So I'm going to come on to the questions that I ask everyone on the podcast in just a second. But if you had it all your own way, could you please outline to me how you would envisage the world might look in, say, 10 years' time, if everything was to go the way that you might imagine with life after capitalism?
I think it's a really tricky question to answer, and in a way, it's difficult because there are obviously lots and lots of different futures. But I mean, I do think, to go back to my point about health, it would be a society in which we cared much more about health. We took that seriously. In fact, I have this kind of idea that the Department of Health should be more important than the Treasury in every economy. And, that would kind of work pretty well to focus our minds. But there's also, I think, something to me about education. I talk in the book about achieving kind of fulfillment through something which psychologists call flow, which is the ability to sort of immerse yourself in the task, and for you almost to lose track of yourself and your ego and your concerns about your social media profile and what other people think of you, because you are immersed in task. And that immersion in task is an enormous way of achieving human potential, it seems to me, and it goes missing in our very, very materialistic lives. So that the focusing on our skills, focusing on our fitness and the sports that we engage in, focusing on other people and our social relationships, and indeed focusing sometimes just on calmness and mindfulness around us. These are all things that generate this sense of flow. And I think it goes missing in society. I think it goes missing because our kids aren't taught about it. It goes missing because of the rush of society. And it is very specifically something that can be learned, taught, and made space for in a post-capitalist world. And that, I think, would characterize the focus on health, a more convivial society, a less rushed society, and one in which actually everybody, and this is in principle available to everybody, this ability, in fact, to find fulfillment in dedicating ourselves to tasks that improve society, and in the process losing our obsession with our own individuality and ego. And so that's obviously it's utopian, but in a sense your question was inviting utopia.
Yes. A utopia where Matt Hancock would be the second most important politician in the land.
I did not say that.
Tim, okay, excellent. Well, look, there's a lot to think about there. The questions that I ask everyone on Zestology is, what is one book that you would recommend and one tip for living with more energy and vitality?
Yeah, so the book, I think I would point to Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, which is a fantastic book. I mean, as a book, it's a book that you can read and be absorbed in, and it tells a long story about human society, human motivation, the will to power, and the values that constitute our sort of inner human condition. And it does it in a very, very absorbing way. It's a fantastic book. It's a long read, but it's a book that you just want to read over and over again. So that would be my book, the fiction book, and then I'm torn on the vitality question, because I think in some ways it's a choice between oxygen and water, if you like. I do think I've for a long time felt that that in the mornings particularly, if you don't leap to coffee or caffeinated drinks and you start with water and I actually have just done for years just hot water with a very small slice of lemon, and that actually it's enormously interesting how much vitality that gives you, but ultimately I would kind of say that the principal one for me would be around breath and around breathing. And we pay so little attention to that. We find ourselves, breathing too shallowly, forcing our bodies into states of fight and flight, never fully reaching kind of parasympathetic relaxation, as it's called, and therefore functioning in suboptimal ways, and over the long term that really loses vitality. And so So I do think for me, probably, the key one would be around breathing. And again, it's something that we don't really focus on, don't really teach our kids properly. It doesn't seem to matter. And we think of as a kind of accidental feature of our lives. But it is something that once you think about it, once you learn a little bit about it, once you practice breathing in different ways, you actually begin again to feel that there is a vitality that is within our grasp, even in complicated, busy, sophisticated capitalist lives. Breath may be the single most subversive thing that you can focus on.
That is a very enticing way of thinking about it, because breath sometimes seems a bit boring, doesn't it? Breathe better, but that subversive makes it sound a lot more exciting. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, it is. You can go too far with some of these things, obviously, but there are extraordinarily different states, physical states. We talk about vitality. That's a visceral physical state. And the way in which you breathe has an enormous impact on that visceral state. And by learning about that, you actually kind of experience these things at first hand. And that, I think, is also something that sort of encourages you into, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying by any means that I have that right in my own life. But it is something that I kind of over time have learnt is an incredibly important part of being alive in a very obvious way, but also in a metaphorical way.
Tim, that is brilliant. The book Post Growth is out now on Amazon and other locations.
And on Hive. Yes.
And on Hive, yeah.
Okay.
That's really good to talk to you. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And the very best of luck with the book as well.
Thanks, Tony. It's been great to talk to you.
That is it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening to Zestology today. Before I go, quick reminder, today's podcast partner is Blood Sugar Breakthrough. Due to the addictive nature of sugar and carbs, we need this supplement. When you have, a donut or a portion of ice cream, or you slip in some way. I've got these CBD gummies at the moment. They've got CBD in them, good. But they've also got gummies in them, which is quite a lot of sugar. And it's just, it's not the end of the world, but I like to keep my sugar levels as low as possible, to keep my energy as high as possible. It is really important to maintain healthy blood sugar levels, and you can do that with Blood Sugar Breakthrough. I'm so pleased that on this podcast, I get to make a little bit of extra pocket money by teaming up with brands that I use anyway. And that is honestly what I can say with BiOptimizers and their product, Blood Sugar Breakthrough. Here's how it works. You safely lower your blood sugar after meals. You maintain a healthy weight, and you redirect carbs to your muscles where they can be burned for energy. That means you'll avoid the worst effects of high blood sugar, like weight gain. And then you enjoy more stable energy, mental clarity, and fewer cravings. And you can get 10% off by going to bloodsugarbreakthrough.health/Zestology. In fact, you can save up to about 33% off if you buy more than one bottle. But even if you just want to try it, use the code Zestology10 and go to bloodsugarbreakthrough.health/Zestology. If you're in the UK, go to bioptimizers.co.uk and use the same code, Zestology10. That's it. See you next week.